So I'm going to start by telling a story of how Zipcar began. My sister Robin was at a cafe and with a friend, and they were thinking about ideas to start a business. My sister was complaining because she has 3 children, and her husband has a car, but they only have 1 car in the family. And she was complaining, I'm going to have to buy another car just to use that car once every week or once every 2 weeks to carry my children. And that's an insane expense. The other person was from Germany, and she had experienced car sharing in Germany. And she said, well, in Germany, we do this car sharing thing. It works pretty well. And my sister, a light bulb went off, and the 2 women at that coffee table went on to form Zipcar. So that was one of the reasons why people join car sharing, is that they only need a little piece of a car, they don't need the whole car. Today I'm going to talk about the US experience of car sharing, in particular the first 5 years of Zipcar when I was there helping to found things. I think that's very relevant to Korea because you are also in your first 5 years now. SoCar and GreenCar were founded less than 5 years ago. I think there are many similar lessons there. I'm also going to talk a little bit about social benefits, and mostly I'm going to talk about the government role and how you can support car sharing. There are, as Professor Cho said, there are 3 types of car sharing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each one from an operational standpoint and from a public policy standpoint, because I think they're actually quite different in the way they work. And I think it's also important to understand the difference between car sharing and car rental. As I saw Professor Cho's presentation, car sharing here is being regulated under a car rental regime. And car rental typically is for a day or more. Typically, you go to a car rental agency, you fill out paperwork, you get the car, you get the keys, you go away for a day and you come back. Car sharing is very different. Car sharing is cars around the city where you are having breakfast, you decide you need to do something, you go downstairs and there's a car nearby. And you take that car to do something that's more than 5 kilometers away, because if it was less than 5 kilometers, you would probably take a taxi. And then you return that car and you leave it, you access it with a card. So there's no paperwork, it's only an hour-long reservation. And I think when we think about regulating car sharing, it's important to realize it's very different from car rental. Yes, you're taking a car that's not yours, but the operations and the placement of the car are very different. This is San Francisco. Mark Chandler spoke earlier, talked about how this is an amazingly innovative economy there, and there are many car sharing companies. But what I want to point out with this map is that these are all the Zipcar locations in San Francisco. If I put all the car rental locations in San Francisco, there might be 20, but there are hundreds of Zipcar locations, and this is not all of San Francisco. This is just a part of San Francisco. And what's interesting from car sharing is that the cars are easily accessible to people, that you can walk to them really easily. A story that I was told early on in Zipcar from somebody who joined was, I sold my car. And I was like, well, if you had a car, why did you join Zipcar? And he said, well, it takes me 20 minutes to find a parking spot, 20 minutes to walk from my parking spot to my house, and then 2 weeks later, I can't find my car. I forgot where I put it. And this is a typical urban experience for people who don't drive very much. So this person waited 6 months using Zipcar to make sure the system worked. And the system worked very well. He was like, I finally sold my car. It only works, though, if it's a network of vehicles, because as our last speaker said, people don't want to risk not getting a car. So it's very important you have a lot of cars around you. And do I have a pointer here? No, I don't. The half a kilometer walk zone is the most that most people will be willing to walk, but they'll be willing to bicycle 3 kilometers. And that's very important because if we look at this red circle, that's the half a kilometer. And there's a good number of cars in a half a kilometer that you can walk to, and it's really a quarter of a kilometer from the center of that circle. And here is a 3-kilometer circle. And so you can see if you have a very good bicycle network, it really makes car sharing work well. Because you can take transit to those cars, but by the time you take transit to them and you get in and out of the train and you've waited for a train, it's not so very convenient. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is one-way car sharing, and I want to talk about this from a public policy standpoint, which is with one-way car sharing, it's very convenient. It's very much like a taxi. You go downstairs, you get into the car, you drive to the airport. I did this to simulate my trip to the airport. And here's the airport. The airport, those little black P's are the place where I could park the car at the airport. And the star is where I want to go at the airport. So it would cost me maybe $6 to take a Zip car for a half hour to go to the airport. But I would have to go from the remote parking to my terminal, which would take a long time. So personally, I would not take Zipcar to go to the airport because you have to walk too far. But it's interesting, you look at there are 5 parking spaces there. So that means that in traditional car sharing, you only have 1 parking space. You take the car, you go, you come back. In one-way car sharing, you need more than 1 parking spot. You need at least 2 parking spaces, maybe 3 or 4. So it's a much more intensive use of parking. And the other thing that happens with one-way car sharing, and also happens with bicycle sharing, everybody wants to go to the same place at the same time. Everybody wants to go to downtown Seoul. It's Friday night. Everybody wants to go to, let me see if I can pronounce this right, Gangnam-gu, to go hang out. So all the cars are in Gangnam-gu. So that means that somebody at the car sharing company has to get people to drive the cars back to where they're needed. And that is also an expense. So for those 2 reasons, I feel like it's very important that we measure the data, which I will get to later, on whether this is in fact a good service in terms of public policy. One-way car sharing does compete more with taxis, and I've covered all those points, so I'll keep going. The next car sharing type is peer-to-peer, and I just show this slide because it's very interesting. These are people's cars that they are putting out there. This is in San Francisco for people to rent. The second car from the left is a Tesla. Do people here know what a Tesla is? Tesla, it's a very expensive electric car. And you can rent this Tesla for $75 or 75,000 won for an hour. I think that's a pretty good deal because I wouldn't want to own a Tesla, but I would want to drive it. So peer-to-peer ratings are very important. As Caitlin talked about, trust is a big issue. I did a peer-to-peer service with a person who owned a dog, and the car was disgusting. And the reviews said that, but I had to experience it to believe it. So there are advantages to peer-to-peer, and I think that it's a very important service because the cars can be put in places where they don't get a lot of use. If SoCar buys a car and they put it, or they rent a car and they put it out for people, it's very expensive if the car is not used. But if you have your car and you're not using it, you don't care if it's not used for a whole week. Zipcar would be very concerned if a car was not used for a whole week. They would move the car to a new location. So there's an advantage that you can put these cars in places with very little use. But as we see this button here, this is a phone app to unlock cars. That technology is expensive, so you can't just put that in every car because that costs $200 or $300 to put into a car, 200 or 300,000 won. So there are problems with peer-to-peer. It's a great concept, and I think it's something the government should support. But the one big issue is insurance, and that is that if someone has an accident and hurts somebody, that there is enough coverage. And this has been a problem in the United States. It's sad to say, but the value of a life in the United States is about $1 million. And the first peer-to-peer company, Relay Rides, had an accident where 2 people were killed. And they had to basically come up with money for a settlement. And this is a crazy thing about the US. But insurance is a critical piece of the puzzle. And left to their own devices, car sharing companies will do what insurance they think is good, but I think governments need to look at what insurance is really needed. I'm going to switch to the social benefits, and where I'm going to end up with this talk is data, that if you have really good data to measure what you think is important, then it's very easy to decide how to regulate. Without data, it's a guessing game. And I'm going to talk about the things in the United States that we think are very important, and I imagine some of them are important here in Korea. The number one thing is a low-cost alternative to a car. Cars are very expensive, and not everybody can afford a car, so having a low-cost alternative is actually a big gain, but how do we measure that? And I'll get into that a little later. Parking is also an issue, congestion, social equity, and social equity is poorer people, low-income people can't afford cars. That's a social problem. They can't get to low-cost food. They may not be able to interview for a job that if they get the job, then they can change their lives, but without a car, they can't do that. And then finally, this is something that I have not heard talked about here, but is very important in the United States, and that is fleet management. Many governments have large numbers of cars that employees use to drive around. And in the United States, car sharing companies have taken over that role for the government and saved the government a lot of money. So I'll just talk briefly about those. The key thing about the consumer product piece is that you're only paying for what you use, and you have a car that's very specific to the trip. So if you were going, suppose you want to put a new cement floor in your backyard, you don't want to put heavy bags of cement in a regular car. You can get a really nice truck and throw them in the back of that truck, and it's the appropriate car. If you're on a date with a person that you're trying to impress, you can take the BMW, the Volvo, the Mercedes, and do that. So, and the final thing is it comes with a space. So these are just things that reduce the costs. And I think somebody asked me earlier, well, what is the economic benefit of that? And I think the economic benefit is, what do you do with the money that you would have spent on a car? If you take the money you would have spent on a car and you go on a drinking binge and drink a lot of alcohol, it's no benefit, it's a disbenefit. But if you take that money and you go to college or you invest in a house, then there's a huge benefit. And I think in expensive cities, and I'm not sure if Seoul is expensive by your standards, I'm guessing it is, but San Francisco is very expensive, Boston is very expensive. Services like this allow people to stay in the city who otherwise would be spending a lot of money on a car. So auto ownership is a very important metric in the United States in that we have too many cars. I think in some countries they're like, we want everybody to have a car, but in most cities there are too many cars in the city. There's too much traffic congestion. So the research is pretty much all over the place. A 2010 study said that each shared car replaces 9 to 13 cars. It's very commonly held. More recent research says 25% of members sold a car, 25% of members avoided buying a car. I was thinking of buying a car, I did not buy a car. I joined SoCar or Green Car. That is important information in the United States because the government, if they really knew they could clearly make this case, there are huge social benefits with parking and traffic congestion. In the United States, it's very hard to get people not to drive. So anything that has this kind of impact is very interesting to government. And I want to talk a little bit about member-to-car ratios. How many people does one car serve? And it almost doesn't matter from a resident standpoint, from a member standpoint. What matters is, do you get a car when you want it? And when I was at Zipcar, 99% of the time, you always got a car when you wanted it. And the reason why that happens is the grouping of cars, the gray car there is busy. This is in the middle of the night, so that's why there aren't many busy cars. But if you wanted a reservation, there's always, you only need one car. You don't need 10 cars, you need one car. So if you have 100 cars and 99 are busy, you still have one car that you can use. And that is why you can have very high member to car ratios. So regionally, if it frees up a lot of spaces, we're most concerned about freeing up the space in a neighborhood. But people drive all over the region. So when they sell a car, they're not just freeing up a space in the neighborhood, they're freeing up a space at the shopping center, they're freeing up a space at work that otherwise would be full, or would be a space that has to be built and paid for. The other thing is there is less driving. And I think I looked online, the SoCar is about $3 an hour, I think, plus a mileage fee. In the United States, Zipcar is about $8 to $14 an hour, including everything, no mileage fee. And the $8 an hour is a modest car, and the $14 an hour is a BMW. Regardless, when people join, they drive less. So there's less traffic congestion. And this is an important thing to measure. All of these benefits need to be measured. And in the United States, we've tried to measure. We've been around for 15 years. I think we're finally getting much better at measuring, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This is just some data that from the most recent study that shows low and high impacts of car sharing. And interestingly, they say the market potential in the US, which is amazing to me, is 10% to 26%. So as high as 26% of houses in the United States. To me, it's amazing because most of the United States is not in a city. I think about half of the United States is in a city. And of those cities, many of those cities are not very friendly for people who don't own cars. In the United States, you need to own a car in most cities. The cities where you don't need to own a car, I can almost list on one hand. So New York City, Washington, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Chicago. There are a few of them, but they're big populations, and Zipcar and other sharing companies have made a business out of those big cities. And then there are universities, which universities are perfect. Students come, they stay at the university all week, maybe they need a car on the weekend, so Zipcar is at 300 universities, I think, or more, just lots of universities. Equity, I talked about this already, and Zipcar has a calculation that the average member saves about $400 a month. So that's 400,000 won a month that the average Zipcar member saves. That is huge, in my opinion. That is a lot of money that low-income people would be better off not investing in a car. I'm not sure how apparent this is in Korea, but in the US, when you buy a car and you drive it off the lot, within a year it's worth 20% less, 25% less. So it's not a good investment. If you need it, it's a good investment if you use it every day. But for many poor people, it's an aspiration. They dream of having a car, but maybe it's not the smartest thing that they should do with the first money they have. Maybe they should invest that in education or housing. It's for them to decide, but the opportunity is there to save a lot of money. So what is the government role? Checking my time, it looks pretty good. The government role in the United States, very concerned about congestion and parking. I think both of these pictures are from Seoul. I was in Seoul 4 years ago at the Korean Transportation Institute, and at that time the question was, could car sharing even work in Seoul or in Korea? And at the time, no one really knew, and I had this slide up as part of a setup of we don't know, it could work, are there parking problems in Seoul, is it expensive? And now it's really great to come back 4 years later and see two companies that are doing an amazing job of getting customers, as far as I can see. Like 1.5 million customers is a huge number of customers. So they have proven there's a business. Whether they can make a profit is something they and their investors will struggle with, I think, and I hope they can because it's a very valuable service. the first thing that government, I think, can do is remove existing barriers. In the United States, car sharing in most places was not prohibited, but not permitted, if that makes sense. In other words, there were no rules in most places about car sharing. Car rental companies had taxes, and in a few cities, they applied those taxes to car sharing. And that immediately made it very difficult to do car sharing because the taxes were so high. If you use a car rental once a month, a tax is not a big deal. But if you use a car once a week, a tax is a lot of money. So the other thing that's important is to define car sharing. If car sharing is not car rental, what is it? This, I've talked about this, it's short-term, it's self-service, it's for residents, it's distributed, the car is available 24 hours a day. If they meet every one of those tests, in the United States, that would be car sharing and not car rental. So if this is essential, very helpful, I think, is on-street parking. And just to talk about that, there's a city outside of New York called Hoboken. They have a program called Corner Car, and Corner Car puts shared cars on every corner of the city. So when you're walking down a street, you see a shared car in the corner. And it's just a really good advertisement for car sharing. But don't lock up parking. Don't make the parking exclusive for too long, because we are in such a fluid environment that a year from now, you may wish you had that parking space back, or 2 years. So do short-term agreements with car sharing companies. Be open to competition and innovation. Real estate development is very interesting for car sharing. It's a long-term thing because real estate takes very long to develop. In the United States, from a plan of a big building like this hotel to it being built could be 6 years, 7 years. But when this hotel is built, it would be very nice if they required, when building it, car sharing in it. And in many US cities, they actually do that. Why? Developers actually very much like putting in car sharing. In the United States, they're never opposed to it. Because parking in the United States limits how much you can build. The zoning code will say 1 parking space per bedroom. And when the architect comes in, the architect is like, okay, I need 10 parking spaces, therefore the building can only be this big. As soon as you put in car sharing, you can build the building that is most appropriate for the site. And that's an important thing. San Francisco has building development regulations for residential. If it's more than 50 units, but less than 200, they must provide 1 parking space. If it's more than 200, then it's 2 car sharing spaces plus 1 for every 200. So as a developer builds a building, they're required to put car sharing. It's not just residential, it's also commercial, and commercial is not residential. If there are more, this is not based on units, it's parking spaces. If a developer puts in a lot of parking, they have to put in car sharing. 50 or more units, 1 space, and then 1 for every 50. And there's a little flexibility. If they do not have parking on site, they can do it within 800 feet. So San Francisco is really a leader on this. And the car sharing company gets the space for free, and they just request it from the city. The city has a list of places that have available parking spaces, and car sharing companies will put their cars there. This is fleet management. I talked a little bit about this. Many cities have large fleets of cars, and fleets are expensive for cities to operate. Often it's a key where you go into an office, you sign a sheet, you get a key, you take the car for 4 hours, you come back, you bring the key. With the car sharing technology, people just take the car like any other member, use their card. There's no paperwork. It saves cities a lot of money. In Chicago, they got rid of 350 cars that the city owned and put in 100 zip cars, and they saved $7 million over 3 years. It's important when that's also available to residents at night. So then the zip cars create a fleet that benefits the whole neighborhood, and that's a good thing. In terms of equity, there's a very strong interest in this in the United States, and this is a program that just came out this summer where in Los Angeles they're putting in 100 cars targeting low-income residents, and they're electric cars. 80 of them are electric. So this is going to be very interesting to watch. From my standpoint, the question is, what is the rate? Because if you charge Zipcar's $8 an hour, if you go into a poor neighborhood and try and charge $8 an hour, it's still too much. I feel like it needs to be subsidized, at least in the beginning, to get people to use it. It's been very difficult to get people to use it in the US, but I heard in Seoul that there was an experiment last year that did very well, and that they got a number of people to use, low-income people to use car sharing. So all of the good things, those were goals that the United States cares about. And talking to people here, and this is not car sharing, but things like Uber, Airbnb, there's a concern about employment, and will sharing economies potentially put people out of work? Or will sharing economies pay less than the traditional economy? And I think those are excellent questions and goals. And when you permit Uber or SoCar or anyone to have on-street parking or to do things that are of benefit to them, I think requiring data is a fair trade. And so I think the government role is make it easy for these innovative companies to start, but then make sure you're collecting the data that measures what you think is important. And this is from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a city with Harvard and MIT and many other universities. These are the things that Cambridge thought was important. They thought people should have more mobility, more sustainable transportation, fewer cars, easier parking, less traffic, less pollution. And they started to gather this data. So I'm just going to show you some of the data. So parking on street, they want to know how many parking spaces are freed up. And this is, or also, are people driving less? So this is actual data from the city. And it shows that in 2000, which coincidentally was when Zipcar was started in Cambridge, the very first Zipcar was in Cambridge, there were 41,000 parking permits issued for 42,000 cars. The blue line is permits, and the yellow line is cars. So the permits issued have gone, oh, sorry, the yellow line is households. So while households have gone up, parking permits have gone down by 10% or 8% decrease in permits. That's pretty amazing, because usually when in the United States, when you say a developer is coming in to build units, people are like, well, what about the traffic? You know, that's just going to make it very hard for me to find a parking space. If you allow this developer to build, I will never find a parking space. My property will be worth less. So with car sharing, you can see over 15 years, while the city grew in population, the parking permits went down. And then some of that is captured in this chart, which I don't even think you should try and read, but I will tell you that the blue is people who got rid of a car, their only car. The red number, the 4%, is people who got rid of their second car. And the green is they would have bought a car. So fully 46% of people in Cambridge said, I would own a car. If car sharing did not exist, I would own a car. And then finally, well, close to finally, the people who drive in Cambridge, it used to be 51% of people drove to work. It is now down to 46%. So it's gone less than 50%, which in the United States as a country, 90% of people drive. So the city of Cambridge is way better than that, and car sharing is one piece of that. One piece of data that I think is very important is the intensity of use, which is, in the United States, people want to know, is car sharing going to be loud? Like, are people going to be banging doors in the middle of the night? And, you know, are they going to be calling the company, how do I get into this car? I just joined Zipcar, I don't know how to get in. So the neighbors were very concerned in Cambridge about how heavily the car is used. Is it a big issue? So we got the data, which is the cars are used on average 1.7 times a day. So it's not a lot, but the hours that it's used today are 9 to 11. The neighbors were also concerned about the middle of the night. Are people coming in the middle of the night to get cars? And 89% of the reservations were between 6 in the morning and 10, and then a lot of the cars were used overnight. So although 10% of the cars were in the middle of the night, it's probably somebody who reserved it all night long. So this is data that the city of Cambridge thought was important. They forced the car sharing company to capture some of it. They captured others of it on their own. So the data shows there's strong public benefits and that capturing data is important. And with that, I'm going to close. We have some discussants who I will introduce in a minute when I get back to the podium. Thank you very much.